Welcome to the Climate Show with me, Tom Heap. I'm on my way to the global summit, COP27. I seem to have this bike lane to myself. And I'm into this giant pop-up city of do-gooders. It's like a horizontal human hive of people with a purpose. 35,000 of them over the fortnight. Politicians, lobbyists, business bosses, charities, all making deals. But this is actually the final weekend of this meeting. In fact, it's already overrun. It should have ended yesterday. Apparently they've been up all night thrashing out the last elements of the deal, because all these COPs are a mixture of events happening around the side, business, NGOs, other groups, and then the politicians themselves. And what's about to happen here is that the European Union are going to give a briefing on the very latest of what's happening, in their negotiations. And so all the journalists are gathered around waiting for the latest clues, the latest hints of whether it's going to be a bit of a failure or whether someone's going to produce a big climate-saving rabbit out of the hat at the end. So let's go and see what we can find out.
We're not going to be able to hear. Is the problem?
This is the European Union's chief negotiator, Frans Timmermans, talking tough, threatening to walk away if he doesn't get a deal. At the front of the scrum is Sky's climate reporter Victoria Seabrook with a pointed question on Europe's role.
Thank you.
Is the EU hiding behind other donors and shirking its historical responsibility for paying for emissions?
Are you serious?
She has been here in Egypt for the whole conference, keeping across the highs and lows of this latest effort to shove the world onto a climate-friendly footing, with regular lives into Sky News. So, who better to brief me on the state of play? Well, we saw you in the thick of it earlier on. You're still working, they're still talking. What are they all arguing about?
It looks like it's coming down to two key things. One of them is loss and damage, what we've heard so much about at this conference, which is who pays when climate disaster strikes. It looks like that is very near the finish line now. And then the other thing that we think is holding things up is cutting emissions and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees.
I often wonder, are they all sitting in one big meeting with 190 plus countries, or is it all divided up and do they have separate speakers? How does it work?
It depends. So sometimes they have big meetings with almost everyone in one room. I was outside one earlier, and when they are meeting about the overarching political document, the cover decision that comes out of this, all of them more or less try to get together, except the room isn't big enough, so they have an overflow room. But then there's also, throughout the 2 weeks, all kinds of side meetings going on, huddles, different ministers buddying up on different things. So it's arranged and it often runs well into the night.
Keeps you covering a lot of distance and a lot of time. Now, you mentioned earlier this issue over 1.5 and also the things about fossil fuels. I gather that Saudi Arabia has been a bit of a block on this. That's a fairly familiar story, isn't it?
Yes, exactly, and Russia as well. So last year at COP26 in Glasgow, countries agreed to phase down coal, and that was quite a win. It wasn't quite what some wanted, but
it was going to be phased out, but ended up being phased down at the last minute,
yes,
didn't it? Yeah.
That's right. This year there's been a big push, funnily enough, led by India, who changed that coal language last year. There's been a big push to try and broaden that out to all fossil fuels. The EU has got behind that, a few other countries, Saudi and Russia pushing back on that. But it's bizarre in a
because
sense.
they're big oil and gas exporters themselves, aren't they? Yeah.
Exactly, and it's quite bizarre because actually they've already agreed to this. The IPCC, which is the United Nations international climate science body, it already has language in about phasing down fossil fuels that's already been signed off by all governments.
Right, and that's from climate scientists, isn't it? And I've been reading some stuff around here, and some climate scientists have been pretty vitriolic about this facade of climate concern. You know, the people with their eyes on the molecules are worried.
Yes, when you listen to the climate scientists, the ones who really understand what is going on, you realise quite how bad things are going to be. Some scientists don't come here because they say it's a waste of emissions, it's detached from reality, wrangling over this language. On the other hand, you've got a lot of scientists here it's an incredible forum of all of these countries in one place, and they try and get leaders as they see it to face the facts.
The loss and damage in question are the harms resulting from sea level rise, typhoons, desertification, or the reverse, floods, punishing forces of nature which cost lives and property, especially in the poorer world. Should the rich long-term polluters pay? The Caribbean has seen worsening hurricanes, so I spoke to one of the region's global ambassadors here.
Success for us looks like they come up with something tangible on loss and damage. I think that's really, really quite important. I mean, we've seen so much landmass loss, we're seeing so much change in crop cycles, we're seeing a lost biodiversity, we're seeing coral bleaching. There's so many things that are happening, and we're right there looking at it. And so we feel extremely vulnerable.
When you add up who's responsible, it tends to be based on the amount of carbon emitted.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, and this might be a British focus because of course we invented the Industrial Revolution, but is a ton of carbon emitted in 1800 when we didn't know the damage as guilty as a ton of carbon emitted now when we do know what it's doing?
Yes, yes.
It is.
I think so. I think because that carbon.
Because surely the irresponsibility is today.
Yeah, but my position is less about pointing fingers, right? As to, okay, well, I want you to do this, although there are things that I want others to do. But the reality is that carbon in the atmosphere, that industrial revolution, resulted in wealth, in historical wealth, in generational wealth that we didn't have access to, that we're now being required to pay for. So whether or not it was something that you knew about at the time, you benefited from it. And it's causing damage. What we know now is that, there are consequences to that wealth.
But when someone's being punished for something, that's usually considered just when they know it's something wrong to do, which we do much more today, and we didn't know 200 years ago.
Sure.
So isn't that a reasonable distinction?
But if someone was damaging your country, whether or not they understood what they were doing at the time, the fact is you're incurring losses that you can't afford to recoup. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement that, listen, maybe we frame it somehow. Maybe we understand that it's a journey that we're on in figuring out how to solve this problem. For example, Hurricane Ian that just passed, that's $67 billion worth of damage, and that's a single incident. We've had $20 million worth of commitment. It's a huge gap. And so it's boundless, but at least an acknowledgement that there is a problem and that we are responsible, without saying we are responsible to cover all of it. At least that helps us to get started on solving the problem.
Now, you've been sending in your questions and we promised to answer them with a little help. So here we go. Simon Layton via the Sky News app asks, how much will the UK reaching net zero by 2050 actually change global temperature? Well, Simon, the answer to your question does depend on how fast we decarbonise, because it's all about the amount of carbon or other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But the estimate is it would change global temperature by between 0.0083 of a degree and 0.016 of a degree centigrade. So that's basically either side of 1/100th of a degree. Now you might say that's not very much, but that's why we're at a global summit, to bring people along to make the change. Jules Peel asks, what area of crops will be required to make the biofuel to power a single transatlantic flight? Great question, Jules, and some pretty big figures. Now, if you planted sugar beet, and that's one of the more efficient at making biofuel, you'd need 25 hectares. That is about 1,000 tennis courts. That's just for that single flight. Now that figure was given to us by the Aviation Impact Accelerator, and they're a group who also helped earlier in the year when we made a program dedicated to the challenges of reaching carbon neutral flight. You can see that program by scanning the QR code on your screen right now. Malcolm Moores asks, will delegates at COP accept that 1.5 degrees of warming is an unrealistic target and that it's dead, and that they should set a more realistic one here? Well, that's exactly what they're talking about all around me, and here's one view.
I don't think that all the parties at COP will accept that 1.5 is dead in the water. They'll want to keep it because even if we're going to go over 1.5, countries and companies need to have their 1.5 targets and the emissions trajectory, the emissions cuts to get there, even if not everyone and every company in the world is doing that, because every little increment, every 0.1 degrees C matters, because climate impacts will increase until we get emissions right down to zero and we stabilize Earth's climate.
There may be deadlock at the top, but what about the thousands of deals that are made by other people around here? Join us after the break. Well, we'll be looking at breakthroughs in food and farming, energy, and even climate-friendly buildings. Welcome back. Well, before the break, we were hearing how negotiators here are struggling to agree a single text to conclude this meeting. So, given that, are the real breakthroughs on climate being made here or down to developments elsewhere? When we look at what actually is changing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's things like, engineers coming up with better, cheaper solar panels. It's things like the war in Ukraine, putting up the cost of fossil fuels. Those are the things that really seem to change politicians' minds, perhaps not this.
So I don't think you're advocating for war, right?
The point I am making is that it's big things away from here which seem to be really making the difference.
Well, of course, because engineers and you don't negotiate the design of solar panels, but what you do negotiate is the headline targets, so net zero in Paris, and then really tightened up as to 1.5 degrees in Glasgow. Why was it tightened up? Because Paris asked the scientists to come back and say, what's the difference between 1.5 and 2? Difference is 1.5 is bad, 2 is terrible. And then that ratchet mechanism which Paris set in motion has started so that the Paris goals start getting translated into national goals. But then what we start to see happening is, what I'm responsible for working with is all those non-state actors. So you get cities like London and Paris having low emission zones. And then you get car manufacturers saying, you know what, we're going to go net zero by 2039. That then emboldens countries to be more, so it's everybody's feeding back off everybody else.
So in effect what you're saying is there's a sort of string or maybe elastic that goes from what happens here to companies or cities or inventors and kind of pulls them in the right direction?
Yes, and what we're seeing is that all converges towards what do we got to do to get to net zero as quickly as possible. So one thing that's been triggered by this process is very clear sense of what the pathway to zero is in every sector. And then in Glasgow we landed that as the breakthrough agenda. So what do we have to do to get to net zero steel? 170 million tons of green steel plants built by 2030. What have we got to do to end the combustion engine? 60% EV sales by 2030. What do we see here in Sharm el-Sheikh? 60 million tons of those green steel plants are now in the pipeline, and we've had growing agreement that we're going to end combustion engine sales globally for cars in 2035 and trucks in 2040.
And I met someone from the building sector who was quite excited about what's happened there. Tell me.
Yeah, so again, built environment huge. 40% of emissions come from buildings, in building them and operating them. And now we've included the breakthrough on buildings in this breakthrough agenda with Morocco and France leading on that, and then the World Green Building Council and many businesses all getting behind those same short-term goals. Reducing emissions massively by 2030, zero carbon operations, and at least 40% reduction in the material content of the carbon.
Yeah, so it really will change the way buildings are built and operated to make them more climate friendly. What happened here?
What happened here as a forcing mechanism and a convening point, and it will have to be translated then into company investment plans, company R&D plans, city building regulations, government procurement regulations. So you can't solve the problem here, but you can send the signals by convening around the headline target, which then get implemented everywhere else.
Are COPs a lot of talk that provides a critical foundation for action, or are they a mask for inaction?
Look, it's a very complicated process trying to get 190 plus countries to agree on anything. So there's often an element of lowest common denominator around what is effectively a single party veto. So I think the accusation of a mask for inaction is sometimes valid when people are deliberately trying to slow things down. But by far and away what they are is a creation of a framework for action, which then requires other processes to fill in. But that then feeds back, right? Because the more you see momentum from the real world, the more it emboldens negotiators to do their job and set higher and faster targets. And that's what we're seeing here. It's a huge risk, it's a huge mistake to think that the only measure of success is the negotiated text. It's also a huge mistake to dismiss the negotiations as not being relevant anymore.
The punishing effects of climate change, of course, don't stop during COP, and nowhere more so than Africa. In Nigeria recently, there have been devastating floods, killing over 600 people, forcing more than 500,000 off their land and threatening the food supply for millions. Our Africa correspondent Yusra El-Bagher reports from the state of Benue.
The floods have come and gone, and the waters of the River Benue have finally receded. The natural pace of life here seems to have been restored, but has it? Benue State is the food basket of Nigeria, Africa's most populous country. And though the deadly flooding has passed, the deeper damage will be felt in the months ahead.
But the rain just carry and go, nothing remain again. Some people fly eat their rice finish.
Nigerian households rely heavily on rice, and demand has outstripped supply in recent years. And now flooding has hampered production even more.
So we were affected by the flood. Water came in full.
Bridget has been processing rice since 2015.
When I started, I was producing a ton and slightly above a ton of rice per day. And the coming of the flood so affected us that even 1 to 2 bags we cannot even mill a day now as it is.
A majority of Nigeria's states have been impacted by unprecedented flooding that destroyed houses and left more than 1 million homeless. It's this damage to a developing economy that is at the heart of the climate justice debate. And at this year's climate conference, activists are demanding Western nations pay their ecological debt.
Look at the number of people that have died already. You want to wait until everyone in Africa is dead? This is the time for climate justice. And climate justice is human rights. Look at the farmers. It's not easy. All your income will go within 1 day.
We met farmers who have lost everything. Just a few of thousands who have seen their farmlands washed away.
All around here are crops that have been damaged by torrential rains that left this land flooded for around a month. And even though the floodwaters have receded, these are rice crops that are unharvestable in a country that relies on the crop to feed its population.
It's almost 100% loss because there will be no harvest.
So there's nothing usable here?
There is nothing usable here.
It's gone?
It's gone.
The most fertile land in the country, now waterlogged.
The rice could not stand the pressure of the water. And at the end of the day, we understand that the whole thing has, some has dried, some has rotten, and everything has gone. Look at it.
So almost every home eats rice. So, but you can see thousands of hectares of rice are washed away. So it's a signal that we experience hunger next year.
It's not just farmers here assessing the damage. Families rifle through the rot for anything they can mill and eat at home. And as world leaders discuss climate change, hunger tightens its grip. Yusra El-Bagher, Sky News, Benue State.
The whole point of these meetings is to lessen the chance of disasters like that happening in the future. So as this COP winds down, I'm groping for my own final communique. Let's have a look at some of the things I've witnessed. Hope and purpose from so many, especially but not only younger delegates.
Climate change is the single biggest threat to humanity.
We are here to represent the voices of young people.
It's always been about survival of the planet.
Not just for listening. We come here to be here. That's why I'm here.
This year, for the first time, there was a youth and children's pavilion. I think I'll leave it to the experts. But many weren't in step with the dominant melody. That discontent was shared at the top table.
We want a good decision, but it's better to have no decision than a bad decision.
But measured by weight of numbers, this is where much of the action is. Huge promotions from many countries pushing their green credentials, sometimes using artworks with slightly opaque environmental links. It's easy to be cynical about this "my exhibit is bigger than yours" grandstanding, but at least climate change is on thousands of lips. So now they're packing up.
Bit of a feeling that the party's over.
What has been achieved? Seppi Golzari Munro has been closing deals. Now she's closing the shop.
It's all packing up here.
Yeah, hi Tom. Yeah, it's been all go, not only on the big meetings with industry and government, but also on the clearing up.
Well, yeah, it looks like last orders at the wind energy bar here. How's it gone for you?
Yeah, we've actually had a really great couple of weeks here talking with a broad range of governments that have been seeking out the wind and solar industries because they're really connecting the dots on how renewables can help solve the multiple crises that they're seeing in their countries.
And then them seeking it out, is that a bit of a change? In the past you were selling to them and now they're buying from you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's really been a step change this year with the skyrocketing gas prices, and so really many countries see it in their economic self-interest to really go big on renewables.
Can you point to an actual deal made here?
Yeah, sure. We've seen the Southern Africa Clean Energy Pool come together to deploy $18 billion in order to get 8.2 gigawatts of renewables.
And just as we were getting some other shots...
Well, they just turned the lights out.
They have just turned the lights out, I'm afraid.
Literally, as we've been filming, we're going to do some other shots. And they've killed the lights in this pavilion. It does show that it's coming to an end. Oh well, guess that's it then, Seppi.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for dropping by.
And some observers spy crumbs of comfort for food and farming too, making the trip worthwhile.
Are you a firm believer that it's worth your presence, your flight, and the 30,000 others that are here in terms of actually helping the climate?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we did some analysis. The emissions from a COP are about 70,000 times smaller than global emissions every year. So the impact is really small. People who say that it's not worth all the flights, really, if you look at the numbers, actually, the difference that a COP makes to global emissions is massive compared to the small amount of emissions caused by having one. But more generally, what a COP is about is not just the texts and the negotiations that come out of it. It is about creating that momentum. So, for example, again, we've seen the doubling of finance for agricultural technology that will help cut emissions from 4 to 8 billion at this COP. And we've seen the UN's food agency say it's going to produce the first ever plan on how the food system can contribute to keeping temperature rises to just 1.5 degrees.
In the end, the success of this COP shouldn't really be measured on the quality of words, but rather the quantity of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And for an answer on that, we'll have to wait.